A very good afternoon to all participants. Welcome to today's session on how to protect ATMs from cyber attacks. Hi, I'm Eileen, and we have Paul here today who will be the speaker for this session. We are from Oberthur Cash Protection. Oberthur Cash Protection is an associate member of the Asian Bankers Association, and together we are presenting this webinar. This webinar has received an overwhelming response with more than 700 registrations from bankers at commercial banks, central banks, and insurance companies all over Asia. Over 30 countries are represented in this webinar. We want to thank the Asian Bankers Associations for their strong support and their extensive network of banks all over Asia. Especially, we would like to thank Mr. Ernest Lin, ABA Secretary, Amado Honrado, Deputy Secretary, and Nick Moreno, Deputy Secretary at ABA. Before we start this webinar, we would like to inform all participants that they can write their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We plan to run this webinar for 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session where we will try to answer the audience questions. Also, we would like to remind all registered participants that they will receive a follow-up email from ABA containing the notes of Paul's presentation and the link to the video presentation at the ABA YouTube channel. Now, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Paul. Paul has been involved with the ATM industry for more than 30 years with broad experience across all aspects of self-service, having held a variety of international roles with major ATM manufacturers in both the financial and independent ATM deployer markets. He has been closely involved with ATM security, sitting on both the British and European standards bodies, as well as the ATM Industry Association's Security Committee. Paul is currently the Director of Business Development at OCP with special responsibility for the North American market. And now, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for the introduction. And also I'd like to thank ABA for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I would very much like to thank you all for joining me today. I do hope that you'll find it time worthwhile because I personally find ATM cyber attacks an interesting topic. They involve a mix of technology and physical activities. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll look at the various aspects of cyber attacks on ATMs and the various measures that can be introduced to protect against them. As you will see in the agenda, I have also included a couple of additional topics that I hope will be of interest. Now let's look at the agenda. Firstly, so that we can look to where the cyber attacks will take place, let's spend a few moments considering the future direction of self-service, something I've called the new dawn of self-service. Then we will look at what is meant by cyber attacks, the variations in the way these attacks are undertaken. This is then followed by what measures ATM deployers can put in place to deter these cyber attacks. What is happening with the other types of physical attacks, ram raids, explosives, etc. And then finally, the impact of COVID that we have seen on ATM users' behavior. As Eileen has said, there'll be time at the end for a question and answer session if you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll look to take questions and then do our best to answer them. If we can't, I'll come back and with the answer later. Equally, you may wish to place the question as you go through, so that will give us time to consider the answer. If I may, just take a few words to talk about Oberthur Cash Protection. If we move on to the next slide. Oberthur Cash Protection, OCP as we're known, we're a division of the Oberthur Group. It's a French group based in Paris and Dijon. We are the second largest independent banknote printer in the world. This means that we're able, as OCP, to gain advanced access to all the latest technology and knowledge on banknote design and manufacturer, which in the case of cash protection industry is a very much a positive benefit for us. As we move to the product slide, this is a pictorial slide of all the products that are within the range of OCP, including those for end-to-end cash protection during the transportation from the cash center to the ATM or branch. There are multi-vendor ATM solutions, Winkle, Nixdorf, GRG, Hyosung, etc., and NCR, and they're all designed to protect the ATM from a wide range of attack types. However, what all these systems have in common is that they all use intelligent banknote neutralization systems as the deterrent. This means that when an ATM or CIT operative is attacked, the banknotes are indelibly dyed with ink so that they are easily recognized as being stolen and so have little or no value. If you would like to know more about these products, at the end of the presentation, there is a little QR code that you can click onto to see more about them. But let's now move on to the new dawn. What is the new dawn of self-service? And it's not just financial touch points. As you see, it involves our day-to-day activities. Self-service is very much a key feature of our life today. The collection of Amazon packages from lockers in petrol stations, gyms, and railway stations, etc. There are even retail stores without staff. We are used to ordering our meals at kiosks when we go to McDonald's, purchasing travel tickets. The list is continually growing. One of those, which is specifically, or rather especially seen in the US, is using kiosks to purchase Bitcoins. One company in the US installed over 5,000 of these kiosks alone last year. In the UK, the news earlier this week was that there are to be even more bank closures. Branches are being closed. It is expected that the UK's big banks will close between 600 and 800 branches this year. HBC will close 1 in 7 of its branches. The reasons given is that under half of their customer base actually actively use their branches. Their customers prefer to use mobile and digital banking. That is not just the case, I feel, in the UK, but all around the world. And this trend, as we have seen, has increased since the start of COVID. These bank branch closures will see and result in more ATMs and self-service being installed, often in locations that are not as secure as a bank branch or the usual third-party off-premise location that we've become used to. New technology will be seen in new locations. It will be chasing the customer. In fact, Chase Bank in the US now only install cash recycling drive-up ATMs, which have become even more of a target because obviously they hold more cash than the traditional dispenser ATM. For example, looking at these cryptocurrency ATMs, which are often located in the rear of mom and pop type retail stores, at a recent ATMIA conference in Orlando, ATM is the ATM Industry Association conference, it was said that some of these ATMs or kiosks can hold upwards of $60,000 US. And it's more than likely to be in a kiosk with just a usual business hours UL safe. Therefore, with the new dawn, there will be new considerations regarding ATM security, different locations, different transaction types, etc., which will make them more attractive to criminals as cash is easy to dispose of and has, as we all know, no audit trail. As self-service has evolved, so we will see physical and cyber crime attacks evolving. They would look to take advantage of all these new opportunities. I can see that as mobile phones are beginning to be used more and more in conjunction with ATMs and self-service, with self-service, that there will be another opportunity there for the criminals to use their attack techniques on cyber techniques on mobile phones. A message just popped up on my screen and distracted me for a second. I apologize for that. As we said, ATMs will continue to be attractive targets as cash is easy to spend and is untraceable. There are other outside influences. In the US, criminals get lower sentences for attacking ATMs as there are no guns involved. And that is, say, compared to robbing a teller. Plus, they're rewarded with more cash. The average cash loss in the US for a bank teller robbery in 2021 was $6,000, whereas for an ATM, it was $44,000. As we will see, threats will also evolve, as we see them here in this diagram. An example was in the US in 2018, there were relatively few physical attacks on bank-up, drive-up ATMs. Then, almost overnight, hook and chain arrived. ATM attacks increased dramatically, as all the copycat criminals needed was a hook and chain, plus a large 4x4 pickup truck, and the instruction video on YouTube. Now we're seeing explosive attacks are on the rise, since the criminals have learned how to use more effective explosives. While copycat criminals for hook and chain found it easy for cyber attacks, for cyber attacks, it's not that easy, which is perhaps explains why attack numbers have not grown as rapidly. Those familiar with the ATM attacks in Europe will know that similar trends were also seen here. Attack methods change over time, but total numbers keep increasing unless steps are put in place. Usually these steps are encouraged by unacceptable losses to the ATM deployers, or in a number of countries by the introduction of legislation or regulations, as been seen in France and Belgium. As we look at logical attacks, I've set the scene, and now perhaps we can look at cyber attacks in more detail. I've split it in two. There's logical attacks and the physical element of the logical attack. I'm not looking at those cyber attacks that come from the host on ATMs. You may remember the attack in the metropolitan New York area in 2013 that resulted in reported losses of some 40 million US dollars when hackers got into the host and were able to allow criminals to withdraw unlimited amounts of cash from something like 3,000 ATMs in the area. So throughout the presentation, when I talk of cyber or logical attacks, I'm referring to criminals obtaining cash as a result of installing malware, unauthorized software onto an ATM in order to rapidly dispense cash, or by taking direct control over the ATM's dispenser so that it empties out all its cash. Just to clarify it, what is meant by malware refers to unauthorized software. Could you go back a slide, please, Ealing? Thank you. Also, malware does not have to be active as soon as it's loaded. It can remain dormant in the ATM. Then later, when a predetermined bank card is entered, the malware can come to life. The ATM will then be instructed to dispense all its cash to that criminal. However, most attacks occur when the criminal is there and is able to gain access to the ATM. They can install an ATM software stack. This can be done by gaining physical access into the ATM, or by possible collaboration with a corrupt service engineer or CIT operative. The most common approach to load malware is by accessing an unprotected communications interface in the ATM. For example, a USB port, or one of the legacy interfaces that's still left within the ATM itself. It can be done by a memory stick, or more likely by connecting a laptop PC, which in turn can be subject to a remote connection. It may be that a connection is made to the cable that links the PC to the dispenser unit, so an instruction can be sent directly to the dispenser to cash out. Criminals could gain access over the internet or dial-up, depending on how the ATM has been configured, even bypassing authentication processes. Over time, these initial vulnerabilities were removed and have been removed, and ATM designs have changed. But in its turn, malware has developed. For example, it includes features to counter detection, even to prevent deletion. So let's look at some of the terms that are used when we're talking about cyber attacks. The first one on the list, jackpotting, a term that came to the attention of ATM deployers at a black hat security conference held in Las Vegas in 2010, was on the stage. There were different makes of ATMs, all made to cash out, spewing out dozens of banknotes until the dispensers were empty. Hence the name jackpotting, from the many thousands of slot machines in the casinos. It is also known as cash out. However, as it turns out, similar attacks have started in Eastern Europe in the year before. Man in the middle, this simply refers to cyber attacks when a PC is fooled into dispensing cash without debiting the account. Let's look at black box, which is the most common term. Here, an unauthorized external electronic device, such as a laptop, is connected to the ATM, hence the term black box. It's often a laptop, and once connected, it sends out cash out commands to the ATM cash dispenser. The big question is, with all security measures in place, how can criminals gain access to the inside of the ATM and the dispenser? There are two likely attacks, either via the top cabinet or more likely through the fascia. Unlike, say, a hook and chain or ram raid, where the criminal needs little or no ATM knowledge, with cyber attacks, the criminal needs knowledge to logically drive the dispenser, which USB port to connect to, and of course the right table to disconnect, etc. Perhaps because of this need for knowledge, cyber attacks are also not as common as other types of attacks. For example, according to the 2020 figures from EAST, which is the European Association for Secure Transactions, across 21 countries, out of all ATM attack methods, black box was only seen in 9 countries, and which made it list of 13th on that list. So it was way behind card skimming, cash trapping, ram raids, etc. As a result of COVID, the number of explosive attacks in 2020 went down 52%, whereas the number of cyber black box attacks dropped by a staggering 74% in the same time. Let's look at the next slide, which is remote control, which you've seen before. This actually is trying to pull together a schematic of how a remote cash out jackpotting attack can be undertaken. There's a criminal on site at the ATM. They gain entry through the fascia. They make connections, and then a colleague joins them remotely using, for example, TeamViewer, and undertakes all the technical software activity. As a result, a crime committed in Slovakia can have the technical person sitting happily in Paris. All the criminal on site has to do is then wait to collect the cash and depart. The next slide looks at how these criminals gain access to the ATM. This slide clearly shows how they've been able to make holes in the fascia to get through to the key points. They're known to cut at the most vulnerable places on the fascia to enable them to get into the connections inside. Here we see on this particular model of ATM, and they all vary from ATM to ATM, but on this model, as you see, it's either the top left or the bottom right-hand corner. They cut through and are able to access the key points. Older ATMs used to have blanking paints that some of you may remember that used to cover the holes where there would have been other features such as a statement printer. So those gave ready access to the inside of the ATM. These, of course, have all been changed. By coincidence, yesterday, I received an alert from EAST that between the 14th and 15th of February in Slovakia, there were 5 cyber attacks. They cut a 15 centimeter by 15 centimeter hole at the bottom right-hand side, as you see on this example of the fascia. However, none of them were able to be successful. Thanks to the logical measures that were implemented that we'll come on to in a moment. But however, it still costs $4,000 euros for each ATM to be repaired, plus of course the costs and inconvenience to customers and the bank. When there are physical security measures, criminals can see them, such as locking bars, etc. There are warning labels. This is not done with logical protection measures, so criminals attack every ATM regardless in the hope of being successful. I would now like to share with you the ways to defend against cyber attacks at your ATMs by implementing various logical and then physical measures. First, as we see here on this slide, these are the logical protection measures that you can put in place. Number one, for every ATM installation, a risk assessment should be undertaken and the security measures be implemented that are relevant to that perceived risk profile. As circumstances can change, this should be done as a one-off exercise when it's installed. It could be a yearly event, perhaps using third parties on occasions to see if the measures that have been introduced to protect ATMs can actually be breached. As part of the risk assessment, consideration should be given to the physical environment where the ATM will be located. For example, through-the-wall ATMs are more suited for unattended locations than lobby machines. Also, the grade of safe to be installed needs to be considered. The second one we look at is the password policy. It's important to establish a policy for all passwords. And the point here on the screen is, please do not rely on the manufacturer's password. I recall a few years ago seeing the results of a survey that many ATMs used by IADs in the US simply had the same lock settings as they were when their manufacturer delivered them, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we move on to 3. It's important to establish a secure firewall. An ATM firewall should be configured to only allow the known, authorized incoming and outgoing connections that are necessary for an ATM environment. It's not a proper PC, it's an ATM. These connections should be configured per program rather than per port. We look at the fourth one. Implement secure communications. I think this goes without saying. End-to-end authentication. Use transport layer security. For example, manufacturers offer this, and NCR's offering, I think, is called Secure TLS Encrypted Communications. We look at the ROM bias. That should be secured to prevent alternative action or booting with other ROM biases. Only boot from the primary hard disk. Please remember to ensure that changes to the ROM BIOS settings can only be made when undertaken with password protection. Install, for 6, anti-malware environments. An active whitelisting application. For example, the Solid Core suite is widely used with ATMs. Now, what we need to do is harden the operating system. The aim is to reduce the security risk by eliminating the potential attack points in the system, thereby reducing the system's attack surface. To do this, the application runs in a lockdown account with minimum privileges allowed. I would also suggest that consideration is given to disable autoplay. Looking at number 8. Still in the same line, remove all unused services and applications. Don't leave them on the machine if they've now failed to be part of your normal suite. As with hardening the operating system, these will reduce the surface area for attacks. Importantly, when distributing software, use a remote distribution system that is secure. This will assist in maintaining the integrity, availability, and confidentiality of your ATMs. It also allows for the timely and fast distribution of updated malware signature files once malware is found on your ATM. Now, looking at the next point, which is also related to software distribution, please make sure all software is kept up to date, all patches from the operating systems, etc. Establish a regular patching process for all installed software. 11, access control. Implement rule-based access control. For example, define the different accounts for different user privileges. Restrict the allowed functionality via remote desktop access to ATMs. Finally on our list is deploy a network authentication to prevent access to files when the ATM software is not running. ATM manufacturers offer their own solutions and there are third-party solutions as well. But for example, NCR secure hard disk encryption is available. I'm sure that many of you listening can think of other measures, but I would guess in the main, they would generally fall under these 12 main headings that we at OCP feel are relevant to logical security. Now, if we look at the next slide, this actually talks about and looks at the physical protection you can do. As well as the logical, we look at the physical, as I've said. We need to find a way of preventing them gaining access to the ATM in the first place. We've already talked about the location the ATM should be in to make sure it's at the least risk, and the use of through the wall in unattended locations. Also, when selecting the ATM itself, a decision criteria should be, for example, is the communication to the dispenser protected, such as encrypted? Is there an armored cable? Similarly, communications with the key modules, such as the card reader, PIN pad, should all be protected. Does the ATM use a controller or a standard PC with US ports, etc.? There's also this issue of whether the PC or controller should be in the top cabinet. It's in the top cabinet because on balance, it's easier for the service to be undertaken, and it's also available to, as we say, service engineers, but it would be more secure in the safe. However, if it was in the safe, it would mean that the service engineer, in many instances, would have to be accompanied by a CIT operative if they wanted to have access to it. So on balance, manufacturers have still kept it in the top cabinet. However, they have looked at altering their designs so that access points to the system, such as the USBs or cables, cannot be easily accessed via the fascia. So, as we saw in the earlier picture, there are two access points. First of all, the top cabinet. It's not unusual for all ATMs from one manufacturer to share the same key to lock that cabinet. You can have individual keys per cabinet, but this then creates organizational problems for service engineers, cash in transit operatives, as well as branch staff, as they all need to have these unique copies. In practice, I think, as we all know, if the operation becomes too difficult, it will fail. There is anecdotal stories from countries where that they have tried to implement this idea of a key per ATM, and all that's happened is that the key has been hung on a nail just by the ATM. I'm sure that we all know of instances where the door entry codes are written on the wall next to the PIN pads. Of course, there is the potential now to have an electronic lock fitted to the top cabinet. When considering, as I think we've touched on, the security of the top cabinet, the risk analysis should consider the security environment of the operators that come to use it, plus the fact that it may well be in a branch that has its own security environment. When monitoring the ATM, I think people should be on the lookout to see if there's any unusual or unexpected action that could indicate the ATM itself is being attacked. It could be that you could use CCTV cameras to monitor the fascia. The software now that can determine if people are staying there longer than they need to complete a transaction. This can then draw the attention of those responsible for monitoring the cameras to check out the situation. Another more common approach has been, with the ATMs that are installed, is to fix steel plates behind the fascia at the key attack points, as we saw in those earlier pictures. They hadn't done it. However, this doesn't prevent the determined criminal from attacking the ATM. as they know that once they get through that steel plate, they can undertake the crime. A much more effective alternative is to implement a Fascia Protection, where a membrane or film is incorporated onto the fascia. This will detect when the fascia is being attacked, i.e. being drilled, cut, etc. The system will then halt the dispenser, so even if criminals can gain entry, they cannot receive any cash, or alternatively, the ATM is powered off. The criminal realizes the criminal realizes that this has happened and will leave. This type of system can also be used to protect the top cabinet. Coming back to what I said before about identifying protection on the ATM, this sort of protection can actually be labeled as such on the face of the ATM, so criminals are aware of it and move on to different ATMs. The slide that we see in front of us shows the type of protection that I'm talking about. It's not intended to replace the need to implement the logical protection measures described earlier. It should be simply seen as an added layer of protection. We believe in OCP that even with cyber attacks, the security measures should be in layers to reflect the perceived risks. For the last few minutes, if I may, I'd like to update you on what is being seen happening around the world with other than cyber attacks. Okay, right. I think we all know COVID reduced the number of ATM transactions. It also therefore resulted in the number of ATM attacks going down as well. So this is information that happened in Europe. And also we look at some of the security measures that have been introduced. I've used again the figures from East for the first half of 2021 against comparing them to the first half of 2021. So we've got 2020 versus 2021. As you see, logical attacks went down significantly, that's cyber attacks. Explosive attacks went down 52%. RAM raids went down 42%. Interestingly, vandalism increased across Europe. However, all signs that we have now are that ATM attacks will return to pre-COVID levels in the next few months. We see physical attacks, but always are around about 30 to 33% successful. I don't know what your figures are, but these ones tend to be the average. However, whilst they're only a third successful, they always result in 100% of damage. And that's even worse when explosives are used. So I think to reduce ATM physical attacks, it's going to be a mix of operational and other preventive measures. Let's move on to the next slide, please. This slide shows the picture of the attack profile across Europe. It clearly shows that pre-COVID, despite all the measures that were introduced, ATM attack numbers were increasing. However, there was a significant drop in 2020. We saw that again in about 2021. And as we said, we're expecting levels to return to 2019 in 2022. I think what also happens here is some countries have invested heavily. For example, in the Netherlands, the Geldmat ATM Association has invested in good security. And as a result, the number of attacks in the Netherlands has dropped off dramatically, far higher than in other parts of Europe. The next country to look at is the US. Here we see some pictures, which I think you most probably are familiar with, which show various ATM attacks. The US have seen over the last couple of years or so a growth of about 100% plus in the number of attacks. There are hotbeds, Houston, Dallas, and in the last few months we've seen the attacks in Florida and Kentucky rise dramatically. Whereas in Europe, the general approach has been when attacks have increased, they've introduced cash protection regulations. Or in those countries that didn't do that, such as the UK, the jail sentences for those criminals that use explosives to attack ATMs have been dramatically increased. This isn't happening in the US. It's almost the reverse. As I mentioned earlier, robbing a branch which involves a gun gets a far higher sentence than somebody who attacks an ATM even using explosives. More money stolen, and there were instances quoted at that conference I mentioned earlier, the ATMIA in Orlando, where criminals can actually be out within a day or so of committing the crime. So now what we're seeing is it's putting more and more pressure on ATM owners to look after their ATMs and protect them against attacks. This next slide that we'll show shows a survey that was undertaken in 2021 by OCP in conjunction with ATM Marketplace. I've done a comparison here between Europe and the US for you to see the different approaches that you could therefore consider. It's not a direct like for like, because many of you know that in the US, there are far more independent ATMs deployed than there are in Europe. And a lot of those ATMs are only on business hour safes. Europe has gone down the road very early on for the use of SEN safes rather than UL, introduced gas safes as far earlier than has happened in the US. And I think that counters for the fact that, as you see here, it looks at what measures were put in place by ATM deployers after they had been attacked. For example, coming back to legislation, in Spain, SEN 4 safes on ATMs is a legal requirement. There's no such thing in the US or in fact the UK. I thought this bit about alarms you see at the top was quite interesting, as I would have thought branches and ATMs were already alarmed, but that doesn't seem to have been the case. Cash protection is mentioned, greater in Europe than it is in the US, because in Europe, a number of countries actually have that as a requirement, that machines should be protected against gas, such as in Geldermalsen in the Netherlands. Tracking is higher in the US than it is in Europe. I think perhaps that could be that they've been used to that in a branch environment in the US far more than in Europe. So I'm not surprised it's been used in ATMs. There's, I think, sometimes terminology differences, as they say, it's not just the language that's different, it's our terms we used. ATM closures in Europe tend to refer to secure closures where you see around an ATM in a high street to protect it, whereas in the US, enclosures can actually refer to advertising type enclosures, which are really not that secure. However, what I would like to draw your attention to is the ink cassette ink. That has grown dramatically both in Europe and in the US and has been taken up. These are not die packs that you may be used to. It's an advanced ink die technology that is mandated in France, Belgium, and in the Netherlands, and other customer groups such as in Italy. And in Spain, there's legislation going through Parliament. What this does, as we mentioned earlier, is indelibly die the notes. Both in the US and Europe, this has been seen as an effective deterrent. And I can speak personally to say that there's been a significant take-up in the US recently as a result of the surge in the ATMs attacks that they've experienced. One of the things that backs this up is that Europol, the pan-European version of the FBI, produced a report in 2019 where they looked at attacks across Europe and concluded that IBNS, intelligent banknote neutralization systems, were one of the two most effective deterrents. The alternative that they came forward with, which is eerily impractical, was just to have enough cash in the ATM for a day's transactions, which I think you'll agree is not really a viable option. With the growth and the installation of cash recycling ATMs, which traditionally therefore hold more cash than a dispensing ATM, I can see that there'll be even more reason for criminals to start attacking ATMs in drive-ups and third-party locations where these ATMs are located. Now, the background to this is proof. And if we look at the next slide, you'll see this is from France. As we said, there's legislation in certain parts of the country that ATMs must be located, they must have ink and die. And this shows that since the installation of that regulation, the number of ATM attacks has fallen dramatically. And as you see for Q3, it is very small. And this information was used by Europol as part of their rationale for proposing that IBNS is the solution to adopt. The next slide refers to the idea of layers. We've talked about layering countermeasures. So we saw the various ones that could be used when we saw the comparison between the US and Europe. Many of those measures involve extra armor, stronger safes, locking bars, but they're likely not to be effective, as criminals will simply find a way around them. They'll start to use stronger explosives, more powerful grinders or cutters, etc. So these measures in the earlier side are often designed to be for specific attack types and therefore not effective against other types of attacks. So however, at the core of this is, in fact, IBNS. So if we could look at the IBNS solution. Next slide, please. Because I don't see IBNS as necessarily being a method against cyber, because all they'll end up is getting dyed notes. But it is against all the other physical attacks. As you see here, the features, it's fast, it's traceable, etc. And on the right-hand side, you actually see the notes, how they come out of the system when they've been dyed. If we move on to the next slide, there are two types of IBNS. There's the intelligent, the passive. The passive is basically a bottle of ink in a dispenser, in a cash cassette, in the dispenser. The explosive happens and the ink covers the notes. Hopefully it does. Whereas intelligent, it can be activated on all types of attacks, as we'll see in a moment. It's completely effective. There are certifications, etc., such as France, where 100% of the notes have to be dyed to a minimum of 20%. If we move to the next slide, please. Here we see the reasons why it's effective. It combats all the crimes you can think of, even duress, ram raids, gas, explosives, etc. The currency, as we said, has zero or little value. And we've got pictures on the right-hand side of shopping malls where the ATMs which were protected by IBNS have not been attacked, where those without IBNS have. A taggant, a trace element in the ink, means that criminals can be related back to a particular ATM crime. And here we see the solution on the right-hand side, which is end-to-end. It goes from the ATM to the cash center. Can we move on to the next slide then, please? We talked about earlier on what customers and users of ATMs had concerns. And I said I'll spend a few moments talking about those. Behaviors have changed, as I think we've all seen. ATM transactions which fell are starting to rise, but not so much. Here, these three pictures illustrate three examples of what we've seen. Banknotes. There were unfounded rumors that you could catch COVID from handling banknotes. This saw a massive switch to using plastic cards. It's been proven beyond doubt that banknotes aren't dangerous. You can't catch COVID from these as any more as you can from a handle or something else in a shopping mall. One way of addressing this has been that in the middle slide, the ATM manufacturers now have ultraviolet light that is played over notes as they're deposited and dispensed, so therefore kills any chance of a virus. Also, it can display ultraviolet light across the PIN pad, again destroying any virus or germs. On the right-hand side, we look at the screen. And I'm told that in certain countries, it's not uncommon for people to bring their own spray, clean the screen before they touch it. What we have got there, and we'll look at and move on to, is a means of putting a film on the screen. And this comes from the fact that banknotes produced by OCP actually have a film. If we move on to the next slide, please, have a film which on the banknote prevents viruses and germs being passed from banknote user to banknote user. What we've been able to do is take this technology and implant it into a film, a membrane, that is then paints are put onto the touchscreen so that customers can be sure that they're not going to catch a virus or germ from it. Why I wanted to go onto this last screen earlier is to talk about the conclusions. I think, as we've seen, existing logical and physical attacks, cyber attacks, will remain. they'll improve, they'll change. The balance between attacks will alter over time. There's going to be concern over the new non-traditional locations that self-service will be introduced into. One of the things I think we must feel that you should do and consider is logical and physical protection measures from the very start. Look at the location it's going to. For logical cyber attacks, it's a mixture of locking down and putting applications, etc., such as solid core onto your ATM, and also introducing physical detection measures to prevent access to the interior of the ATM in the first place. From physical attacks, I think really, if you are going to introduce one measure, that should be intelligent banknote neutralization systems, because they are an effective deterrent against all physical attack types, including explosives, ram raids. One of the things we think that is important that you consider is for both cyber and physical attacks is whatever you put in, it should adhere to standards where there are some, such as for IBNS, it would recommend the French standards, and certifications, etc., for software. One other factor to consider is that you can turn your ATM into a fortress, but what you do as a result of that is actually not make it attractive to the CIT, either the CIT operatives or the engineers to get into, but most of all, it would deter your customers from using it. They need to be feeling safe that the ATM is in a good location and is safe for them to use. So really, I've come to the end of my presentation. If you move on to the last slide, we'll now move into questions. So if anybody has some questions, we'll quickly move on to the Q&A. Okay.
Thank you very much, Paul. We hope that you all enjoyed this amazing presentation. Yeah, so I'm going to take a look at the questions. Yeah.
How can new technology make ATMs more secure? Right. Okay. I think what you're seeing with new technology is I mentioned it earlier that ATM technology has improved and the design of the ATMs has improved. They have moved key components away from access via the fascia. They've introduced their own anti-skimming devices. I think when you look at add-on technology, I talked about the idea of IBNS for physical technology, the idea of using the membrane across the fascia to prevent attacks. So I think you look at the technology in each of the ones that I mentioned has a way of making the ATM more secure. The idea is you layer it to suit the location that you're putting the ATM into. There's a question about which firewalls do I suggest. My suggestion would be that you need to talk to your IT people, your ATM supplier, and your security people to identify what you feel is the most secure software for yourselves. Again, as I said earlier, consideration should be given to wherever there is a need for certification and mandating, etc. Okay, is there any other question at all? Do we have anything in the chat?
Yeah, I have a question here.
Sure.
Software related to if there is any differentiation between the Linux system and the Microsoft.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Linux, Unix, we're only seeing that in ATMs in very few instances. It's quite predominant in Brazil. I believe one or two banks like Santander did deploy ATMs with Linux. My feeling is that the bulk of the ATMs are on Microsoft. And as a result, it's a well-known system. There's lots of tools in the marketplace. And I think on balance, that can be protected, whereas I do have this element of doubt with Linux, which is very much a crowd-funded solution, that somewhere people could get into it and it's not as secure. But that really is a personal feeling about it. So I would tend to look towards Microsoft, I think, rather than a Linux-based ATM, purely for that reason. But that is a good question. It's a good thought.
I have another question here. When updating a patch, what is the best way to push the patches to the ATM?
Okay. I think first of all, one means to make sure that you look at the patch and decide whether it needs to go down or not, and you do it as quickly as possible on looking at the security measures. Yeah, I mean, some patches don't have to go down immediately, others. But coming back to what I said, I think you need an effective ATM system to be able to pass down new software upgrades to the ATMs quickly and securely. All manufacturers, and there are third-party products, Calignite, for example, from Cal, I think it's Vision from NCR, use those systems to download patches and new software to both OS and to the application.
Okay, I have another one here. He says, any threat identification blocking tool which can be installed to the ATM.
Any threat identification blocking tool that can be, okay. I think what you can do is there are, as we talked about, for if you want someone to attack or make a hole in the fascia, you can have that fascia film. You can have sensors that will say whether the doors have been illegally opened or not. You can have sensors that would identify if the ATM is being attacked by, say, a thermal lance. You can have sensors that will identify if it's being attacked by, say, gas. And you can see if somebody is trying to put a solid explosive in using a pizza paddle because the note dispenser shutter has been forced open. So those identify that machine's being attacked. There are blocking tools. For example, you can have within the prevent the paddle going in through the dispenser, have a second shutter that basically locks off the entrance to the ATM, so the paddle can't go into it to deposit the explosive. But I think at the end of the day, the blocking technique is to have the deterrent that says if you do attack this ATM, you're not going to get any cash. And what cash you do get is going to be covered in ink and have little or no value. So therefore, the reward for attacking the ATM isn't there. Move along to the next ATM that's not pre-protected and attack that. Hopefully that's answered that particular question for you. Is there another one?
Oh, we have a series of questions here.
Oh, good. Let's go.
Yeah. Any modern RegTech solution to address the ATM attack? For example, he says to make use of IoT or AI monitoring.
Okay. The IoT, Internet of Things, yes, I think that is something that we're going to see that would drastically change a number of things in them that we'll be using. Cameras, ATMs themselves, I think will also change. I'm not really sure of the measures to say, except that I think you can use artificial intelligence to realize, as I said, a camera can see if a person standing outside an ATM has been there longer than we would expect for someone doing a transaction. Therefore, they're attacking the ATM. It realizes that and alerts a monitoring person to get involved and decide whether or not to call the police. So I see that sort of thing coming along. What you see also is ATMs are becoming more effective at informing their management systems that, say, for example, the dispenser is going to malfunction. Something's not right. In the olden days, you just got a message saying it's broken. Now you can see that. So suddenly, if a feature like a card reader or something like that suddenly stops without these pre-warnings, that's an indication that it's possibly being attacked. So that's how I see you can use modern and new technology to help prevent ATM attacks happening. Right, I'm conscious there's more and we've got a little time, so let's move on to the next one if we may.
Yeah. In the Q&A, there are a few more.
Okay.
Should I read for you?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. What is the impact or potential impact on the use of outdated operating system in ATM, like Windows 7?
That's a very good question, because I'm a bit of a Luddite in the sense that I sometimes feel that Microsoft move people forward for no real reason, and you can have an operating system that is good enough for your ATM but has to be upgraded because support has been removed. I think the issue is there, support, is that if it's not being protected, there are no patches coming along to guard against threats. Also, if there are a lack of third-party security products that do not support your operating system, then I think you should move. But I don't think you should automatically move to the next level without giving it some consideration, and security is a big factor. So therefore, if you can't secure your ATM on your present operating version like Windows 7, move on to the next level where you can.
Well, along the same lines, there's a question saying, do you know any actual ATM fraud case related to an ATM running on Windows 7 vis-a-vis Windows 10?
Simply, no, I don't. If you can take the name of that person, please, and his email address,
okay.
I will endeavor to find out and ask around and come back to you. But I mean, there's also ATMs out there running on CE, and there's ATMs running on proprietary operating systems as well. So there's quite a variety of operating systems out there.
Okay. Another question here says, if there are sensors that will work if the ATM is online, what if the perpetrator just pull up the plug?
Oh, good question, because they do that. Okay. First of all, from a host perspective, you should suddenly see your ATM has gone offline, and that should start ringing warning bells. As far as the protective measures you've got in place, obviously you would want, and if I can talk about, let's say, the safe, for example, whether you're online or offline, it doesn't matter. The send safe is the send safe. However, what happens with, for example, our system, our ink dye solution, is when power goes, there's battery protection. The intelligence has battery life for something like 48 hours. And if that cannot be, power is not returned within 48 hours, the cassettes have battery life for 2 years and protect themselves. So if a criminal decides he'll pull the power plug, as happens when they do RAM raids, they pull them out, the power gets cut off, the controller goes into battery mode, realizes from the sensors that it's been tilted or the door is being opened, and it sends the action to the cassettes to fire and activate. So again, all the criminal ends up with is inky hands and notes that are covered in ink in the cassettes. So the answer to that question is the systems do defend themselves even without power.
Okay, we have another one here. How to use HSM to secure sensitive information stored in an ATM server?
Good question. It is something I fear I really don't feel confident in answering effectively. Could you make a note of that, and we'll come back to that person?
Okay.
Sorry, my apologies. There are some things that I don't feel confident in answering, and security is significant. And I think to guess or put something that I can't really support to you, gentlemen, isn't right. So therefore, yeah, we'll come back to you with an answer later.
Okay. We have one here. Best anti-malware, and antivirus for ATM.
That possibly relates back to one of the other earlier questions when someone asked something about what is the best software. I really can't say that. I think you need to discuss it with your security people. You need to discuss it with your ATM manufacturer and select the best for you. I know things like Solid Core, etc., are widely used in the marketplace.
Okay. Yeah, many of the other questions are related to the Linux and Windows.
Okay, let's have another go then.
Yeah. Let me see here. Say secure operating system for ATM. I think the question might be, what is the most secure operating system for ATM?
My gut feel, I think, as I said earlier, is I would go towards Microsoft. I mean, one of the attractions of Linux is it's cheap. Possibly nothing. It's built, for those that don't know, by groups of people around the world. They all have their own ideas. It's put into an operating system. To me, that does cause me to have a lot of worry. Whereas something like Microsoft, I know it's more expensive, but there's lots of third-party products. It is therefore something that the criminals know about and will attack. So on balance, my personal feeling always tends to go towards Microsoft solution rather than Linux or Unix. I hope that answers the question.
let me see.
But I'm a great believer in Unix, by the way. I think in the right position, in the right place, Unix is a great operating system, but I'm not so sure at the moment that it is suitable for ATMs. And there's other factors as well, as how you have to, the amount of PC power required, etc.
I think the other questions are mostly related to the ones we already answered. So
how many categories to evolve protected ATMs from attack? I think the answer is that it's layered, and we gave you some examples. You can use physical, like bars, locking bars. You can use stronger safes, ink dye, but it all comes back to what is the core. And I believe the core is the biggest deterrent, and the biggest deterrent to any criminal is that A, he's going to get caught if he does it, which could be the tracer element of the ink, but B, it's just not worth the reward of attacking an ATM that's got something like ink and dye in place. Or, as we said, with the membrane across the front, that this ATM, as soon as it realizes it's being attacked, gets switched off. Therefore, if it's got it, why run the risk of attacking? So hopefully that answers that question.
There's one here that we discussed offline before. It says, do you know the attacks trends in Asia Pacific area? And what is the most common approach? Similar to Europe and the US?
I actually found it, to be honest, rather difficult to find information on attacks in Asia. I mean, generally, Europe tends to be very good because they have East and they have Europol, where all the police forces to get together. In the US, there isn't such a body as East, and the police forces are a little bit fragmented. My feeling is in Asia, we don't hear much about cyber attacks. We tend to hear more about physical attacks happening. So I think it will follow, as criminals tend to learn from each other, I think it will tend to follow the profile of Europe and the US, but that is purely a guess on my part. And if anybody has got any information, I'd love to receive it on ATM attacks in Asia.
Okay, maybe now it's over 1 hour and we have a lot of questions. Let me see one more here. It says,
okay,
how often do you inadvertently ink staining happen? What were the causes? I mean,
sorry.
Let me see the question here. How often do inadvertent ink staining happen? Maybe accidental staining.
Okay.
What are the causes of this accident?
Okay. First of all, I think we need to look at the types of ink staining systems that are installed. And if I could, please forgive me if I just describe how we attack that problem and prevent that happening, it will give you some idea. First of all, where these things happen is that it's a misoperation by a CIT operative or by a field engineer. I think I hate to say it's very, very rarely do you see a false activation happen, because what you do is train the CIT operators and you put in fail-safe devices within the ink dye system itself. So for example, on ours, they open the top lid of the ATM to get into the ATM, and there's an indicator that has LEDs that tells them whether the system is alarmed, disarmed, etc. They open the lock correctly and it goes from armed to disarmed. If it doesn't, the red light stays on. They're taught and trained not to proceed any further. Call a number. They open the safe legally, and for our systems, there's actually another door between them and the dispenser cassettes. It's not a solid steel door, it's a lightweight aluminium door. However, if that door doesn't open, that means that the cassettes are not unarmed. So therefore, the CIT operator shouldn't try and pull the door open. He should accept it and call his support center for help. So by implementing those measures, the number of inadvertent attacks or false activations is dramatically reduced. So hopefully I've been able to answer that question. There isn't a fixed percentage. You can go for years without seeing one, and then you'll see one or two happen in a space of a month, but it certainly is a very low percentage, extremely low, sort of 0.01% type of all installs.
Okay, we have another one here. Eileen, do you want to say something?
Yeah,
have you
the last question maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are some cloud-based ATM endpoint protection solutions which requires ATM machine to be reachable to internet. At least few URLs should be reachable to internet from ATM machines. Do you recommend such endpoint protection solutions?
Could you? Oh, okay. Sorry, we've changed away from inadvertent activations. Okay, can you say that question again, then, please, Ealing, slowly?
Okay. Yeah, there are some cloud-based ATM endpoint protection solutions which
Yes.
requires ATM machine to be reachable to the internet. At least few URLs should be reachable to internet from ATM machines. Do you recommend such endpoint protection solutions?
Personally, again, I would say it's an area. I'm much more physical cyber rather than the cloud and UL. So I really don't feel that I'm competent to recommend those solutions. Again, I would say talk to the experts within your company and within your ATM supplier for their opinions. If you can take the name of that gentleman, I'll endeavor to do some research and come back to him.
Okay, it's
Okay.
anonymous.
I assume it's a gentleman, but or a lady, I don't know who. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Okay, and we have a question also that is for ABA. Does ABA have data related to ATM attacks in Asian region? If so, please share.
I'm afraid we don't have that data here.
No.
Yeah, these are, as Paul says, regulators keep that information quite tight.
Yeah, I think in some countries they share, in some countries they don't, and I think it does tend to be regional.
Yeah,
it is.
Yeah. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so are there any more questions, please?
The truth is that there are a lot of questions. You know.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how long we can.
Oh,
go,
that's
but...
good. I mean, I hate to think it. Does that mean I didn't actually cover what I should have done, or did I put enough out there so people have got questions to ask?
You put the worms, kind of worms here.
Floodgates.
Yeah. When protecting from the malwares, is that okay to use execution restrictions without installing a malware solution?
Okay. Again, I believe you should always have a malware solution in place. I'm not competent enough, because if I say no and they get attacked and they're successful, then sue me for advice. I would therefore quite honestly say you really do need to talk to your own security people about that answer. But my personal view is I believe malware solutions should always be in place. It's one of the basic layers.
We went beyond the time, but anyway, maybe one more. Do you have anything over there?
Sure.
Eileen?
1 second.
I'll tell you what, Eileen, while you're doing that, could you kindly put the last slide back up, please?
Yeah, I will. 1 second.
Thank you, because I noticed people are asking for IDs, and on there is my ID, is a QR code to reach my ID, and also to...
Can you see my screen?
Yep. Now just go on to full screen.
Yeah, 1 second. Oops, it doesn't work. Not sure why. Mick, maybe can you help me to share the screen from your side?
Let me see if I have it here.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not showing.
1 second.
Now you see it, but once I put the full screen, okay, what about now?
Yep, it's not full screen, but it doesn't matter. Its code is there.
It's okay. Now it's
okay. Lovely.
That's okay.
Lovely.
Okay, perfect.
Right.
Yep.
Okay, for anyone listening who wants to be able to contact me, please use my contact details there. Yeah. Okay, right. What was the last question then we had?
I have one here. It says, any threat identification? No, I think you already answered this one. If you have a firewall device, no need to install anti-malware or antivirus?
Okay, I don't understand. I come back to layers and talking to your professionals. I believe in security, that you can never really have enough security. And therefore, I think you do put whatever you can onto the machine to protect it, because criminals are very intelligent nowadays. And the danger is that they could quite easily find a way around one of your security measures, certainly inside the cyber environment, and be able to attack your ATMs very quickly before you realize.
Okay. Well, Ilian, now up to you now.
Yeah, I think we have concluded the webinar. Well, thank you again, Paul, for answering those questions and the amazing presentation. And also thanks, Mick, for taking the questions. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. So thank you all for attending, and thanks to ABA. We hope you have learned and enjoyed this presentation. Goodbye. And if you'd like to add anything, Paul and Mick, before we end this.
I would like to share with you and say thank you to everybody for coming along. Hopefully you found it useful. I apologize I wasn't able to answer all your questions, but there are areas I feel that it wouldn't be right to do so. However, if you'd like to make contact with me using this QR code, I'll endeavor to get an answer for you. So thank you very much indeed. And thanks again to ABA for organizing such a webinar. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Good.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.